I recognize the honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak to the reasoned amendment to send Bill 198, the Financial Measures Act, back. And it was 24 hours ago that my colleague, the member for Halifax Citadel Sable Island, moved this amendment. And when she did so, she made clear, and we have subsequently made clear, how important it is. I think that partially in response to that, partially in response to pressures in constituencies, partially in response to kind of understanding the basic human cost of the budget, and partially in response to protest and hard work by community groups. This government had made an announcement this morning walking back some of the cruelest cuts in this budget, notwithstanding the fact that this time last night they couldn't say if that would happen. Of course we're glad to see that change. But once again, you know, this government will sometimes do the right thing, but only after they've tried everything else. And I would suggest that this Financial Measures Act, both in content and in process, is a good representation of the everything else. So, you know, in content, we're looking at, once again, a completely unrelated omnibus bill. And now, you know, the Financial Measures Act traditionally is one of the few sort of somewhat acceptable omnibus bills because it's all the things that need to be amended to enact the budget. But nonetheless, this one is particularly egregious, and my colleagues have canvassed this. The member for Dartmouth North made the case for the arts as integral to everything we do. Certainly, as you know, I think if this budget is to defend Nova Scotia, well, what is Nova Scotia? What do we think of as Nova Scotia? We think of our culture. We think of our songs. We think of our ships. We think of our paintings. We think of our languages. Those are the things that are getting cut in this budget still. But in this Financial Measures Act, and I'll come back to some of the cruelty that we continue to see, and I would echo also some of the sentiments of my colleague, the interim leader of the Liberal Party, around the cruelty of making that decision and walking it back. But right here in this bill, there are so many strange provisions, and provisions that really require some sober second thought, and that should go back to the department. And to the point of going back to the department, why go back to the department? Well, we have heard over and over again on the floor of this House and in media scrums, this government blame the department for cuts. So several ministers, when asked about cuts explicitly, have said, well, it was the department. And I'll tell you, morale in the public service is bad. That is objectively true. And no one's allowed to talk about it publicly, and everyone knows it. Imagine you decide on a career in the public service. Your job is to give the best possible advice to your minister, to be the subject matter expert who is relied upon to move the ball forward. And then, when seemingly a budget with a ton of cuts presents itself as if by magic into thin air, because nobody has yet to take responsibility for this budget or what's in it, it is you who is blamed. That is deeply problematic. And so, you know, I think we need to look at what's happening in these departments, and we need to be honest about the ways in which almost nothing in this bill could have actually come as good advice. I think my colleague spoke to the anti-science, anti-expert bent of this government, and I think looking at this Financial Measures Act, you see it plain as day. And I'm going to start with the Bridge Commission. We've been talking a lot about the bridge, and guess what? That sits right squarely, half in Dartmouth South and half in Dartmouth North. And so I can say something about the bridge. Do people like to save a little bit of money crossing the bridge? Sure, of course. Have I ever heard a constituent ask for the bridge tolls to be removed prior to that campaign announcement some weeks into the last provincial election? Nope, not one. They're not clamoring for it to be put back, nor am I suggesting that. But on the theme of solutions to problems that never really presented themselves, I think we can put it in that category. And I want to address something that actually hasn't come up regarding the bridges, and that is this idea that the removal of the tolls has helped with safety and traffic. What some members of this House might not know, although it did come through this House in a bill from Public Works sometime before the election, is that in fact, even if the bridge tolls hadn't been removed, we wouldn't be going through those toll booths anymore. So the plan was already in place to remove all the toll booths and to move to photo tolling. So we were going to have, and you see this in other jurisdictions. So you go through, they take a picture of your license plate, and then they send you a bill at the end of the month. That was already in place. And in fact, not only was it in place finally, but the Bridge Commission had been pushing for this legislative change for years and was getting nowhere with the Department of Public Works. And they would come back again and again, and they would say, we got to get rid of these toll booths. It's not safe. It's not safe to have these commissionaires in the road anymore. It hinders traffic. But Public Works wouldn't move on it. Maybe they were already thinking about removing the tolls. Maybe that was the reason. But anyway, you know, when the Crown Corporation, the Halifax-Dartmouth Bridge Commission, found out that this government was planning to remove the tolls from the bridge, when a bunch of people in blue parkas showed up with PC signs in front of their office and announced it. True story. If that's how we decide what we're going to do with millions of dollars of revenue, if that's how we decide to add what will end up being billions of dollars to the debt once we build a new bridge, I'll get to that in a minute, well, that's incredibly poor fiscal management, Mr. Speaker. Again, who are the experts on bridges and bridge tolling? Well, we had a Crown Corporation for that. We won't after this passes, but we had one. It was called the Halifax-Dartmouth Bridge Commission. They did the big lift, a giant construction project that was watched throughout North America. They replaced the bridge while they kept it open. It was a feat. We published a book about it. And yet, nobody even asked them whether this was a good idea. And I can't speak to the current leadership, but I'll tell you that when I was first elected, the previous head of that Crown Corporation, Steve Snyderman, I met with at length when I was first elected, and he was an expert, if you can believe it, in bridges and tolling in North America. He ran like the North American Bridge and Toll Federation, or whatever it's called, and he was so eloquent in explaining to me how important it was that that bridge be independently run by a Crown and be tolled. Now again, I am not taking a position on the tolling of the bridge, but what I am saying is that it is abundantly clear that this government did not listen to or seek expert advice when they made this decision. Because they certainly would have been told that rather than be folded up into all the provincial budget pressures, particularly given the financial state of our province, that at least the Commission, I suspect, would have been just fine continuing to self-finance and knowing that they could conduct the work they needed to when they needed to. Now it's anyone's guess. How many bridges? We keep hearing how many bridges there are. So should we have removed the tolls? Maybe, but I'll tell you another thing, Mr. Speaker. After the decision was made, I met with the Bridge Commission. They're in my constituency. And I said, well, how is this going to work? And they said, we have no idea. We didn't talk about that before the decision was made. But here are some options. And they had options that they were clearly discussing with government, and they weren't criticizing government, but they were telling me where they were because I needed to know for my constituents. And they said, well, we take the tolls off altogether. We put in the photo radar that we now have the permission to do, and maybe we find a way that we charge a toll to out-of-province license plates. I think that's similar to what happens at the Cobequid Pass. Or. There was an A, B, C, D, E. Well, we know how it ended up. Traffic is not better. It's good that those toll booths got removed. They needed to. But it is not accurate to say that the removal of those toll booths is due to the removal of the tolls. That would have happened anyway. And so this is another example. I get all of this is just an analogy. The way this decision was made about the bridges is, I suspect, based on the evidence we have, the way this budget was made. What are 10 or 12 things that sort of make sense and might meet our objectives? Oh, don't ask too many questions. Let's just do it. If it doesn't work out, we'll go back and fix it later. You can't go back and fix tens of millions of dollars of revenue without really making people angry. You can go back and fix what is likely a set of cuts that would have landed this government before the Human Rights Commission. The Facebook posts we saw on the weekend from government members suggesting that these cuts were a result of the human rights remedy, shifting the burden for a court decision onto the most vulnerable people in our province who are least able to deal with it. It was good that some of that, or most of it, appears to have been walked back. But why did it happen in the first place, Mr. Speaker? How can we have faith in a bill, in a budget, in a government that makes a mistake like that? A mistake that costs people their dignity?
Order.
Yes?
I recognize the Honourable MLA for Cole Harbour Dartmouth.
Speaker, I'm just wondering through you if the member would entertain a question. No?
No.
She said no. So that's it.
Okay, yep. I recognize the honorable leader of the official opposition.
Happy to chat with my colleagues at any point, but at this point I am addressing the reasoned amendment to the budget. And so the question is, what research went into this bill? How was the decision made, and my colleague canvassed this at some length, but how was the decision made to tax electric vehicles? Yes, they do it in other jurisdictions. In Quebec, they also have a rebate at purchase. This is part of our environmental goals and climate reduction act, which this government was so proud of legislating the goals when they brought in, goals we will now not meet. I'm not sure what the penalty for that is. Probably nothing. Electric vehicles help us meet our climate commitments, help us nationally with our industrial strategy, help us with our health outcomes. There are whole cities and even countries now that have predominantly transitioned to electric vehicles. I think Oslo is the most famous. They see real differences in social outcomes. Not everyone can afford an electric vehicle, but the key about this provision in this bill is that the rationale for it is not accurate. And both of my colleagues have spoken to that. Passenger vehicles do very little damage to roads. The studies are there, they've been tabled. It is large commercial vehicles that create exponentially more wear and tear. It's a fact. It's probably politically popular to tax electric vehicles, and this isn't the first government that doesn't like electric vehicles. The Liberal government didn't like electric vehicles either. The McNeil government was hugely adverse to introducing rebates. It wasn't popular. But eventually we figured out that it was probably the right thing to do. Now we're penalizing people who have made that choice. Just as we're penalizing woodlot owners who choose to use their woodlot to sequester carbon. And this is another real head scratcher because we have the Leahy report that this government says that they accept. We have an acknowledged lack of a market for low-grade wood. We aren't seeing a new pulp mill being built. We know this. There is some relief for forestry and for woodlot owners who are actively foresting their woodlots in this budget. But we're going to penalize those who don't. We have a triad approach, and some of our forests needs to be left for conservation. But we're going to tax you more if you choose to do that, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if that was the advice. Well, you know what? I take it back. That probably was the advice from the department. Now that we have rid the department of people who are actually in charge of protecting the environment and wildlife and the natural world, the restructuring of the Department of Natural Resources. But prior to that, I suggest that that might not have been the advice of the department. And yet, here we are. Let's talk about easements. Again, if we are going to protect the land that we are legally bound to protect, and that we have funding for the federal government on the line for, then we need to be able to encourage people to donate that land. And we are now being told that even easements in perpetuity are conditional if they cause someone undue hardship. In Dartmouth, we have been fighting to preserve Dartmouth Cove. And the part of Dartmouth Cove that people are most concerned about is the easement. The easement that the private company that owns the cove is saddled with and unhappy about because it inhibits them from doing some of what they want to do. And the easement upon which our community relies for active transportation, for getting to and from work, for outdoor enjoyment. And it is entirely within the scope of possibility, Mr. Speaker, that when this passes, if it is not amended, that there would be an argument from that company that this easement causes them undue hardship. They're already suing the municipality for passing a bylaw that doesn't allow them to infill. Of course, it makes perfect sense that they would go to the Supreme Court and say, we can't infill, and now we can't develop our land because this easement is here. And if you're only looking at the commercial interest of a landowner, if that's the scope of consideration, a court might find that they were right. Because in practical terms, that easement prevents them from developing the land. But what do they want to do with the land? They want to create a dump in the middle of downtown Dartmouth. And so what we need to think about as legislators is something bigger than just the commercial interest of a private company. And just as an aside, Build Nova Scotia owns 2 lots adjacent to that property that they could build housing on tomorrow. I would be really happy about it, but no plan so far. But if this property owner wants to make it a dump, and they say, I can't do that, I can't make it a dump now because HRM won't let me because of the bylaw. So all I can do is, we're just left with this patch of land. What can we do with this patch of land? Well, we can't do anything if we don't remove this easement. It's undue hardship. There goes Dartmouth Cove. There goes the waterfront path that I would say maybe, up to 1,000 people a day rely on. There's never not traffic on that path. And it's a path that runs from Cove, Centre for Ocean Venture and Entrepreneurship, the community college beyond that, and then probably the highest density housing development in my area, owned by Killam, around Parker Street, Maplehurst. Hundreds, at least 1,000 people living there in those high-rise and low-rise buildings. No yards. A lot of people don't have cars. So what do? They walk along the easement for enjoyment, for transportation, to be outside. But maybe it won't be there anymore. And that's an urban example, but I suspect that there are exponentially more rural examples, because everywhere we go around the coast in Nova Scotia, there's an argument about an easement. It's crossing someone's property, it's going to the beach, it's going to the field, and whose easement was it anyway, and does that even still exist, and someone builds a fence there, or someone wants to build a retaining wall there, and the community gets upset. This is a song as old as time. Everyone in a coastal community has seen this play out. So this would provide certainty, maybe, in favor every time of the private landowner and not of the community. It doesn't talk about whether a community faces undue hardship. Talks about whether a property owner does. I would urge this government to send the budget back. I know that every MLA got as many emails as I did over the weekend, and every day before and every day since. And a lot of them are form letters. So they say the same thing. They say, please, pause this budget. Pause these cruel cuts. Come back to us with something you can defend, something you can explain, something that makes sense. Mr. Speaker, this bill doesn't make any sense. The Speaker wanted me to talk about meat inspections. She keeps urging people to talk about meat inspections. So let's touch on meat inspections. 5 meat inspectors have been laid off. I wonder if this was expert scientific advice, or if this was a strange way to reduce the public service. Sandra Mullen from the NSGEU said they are reducing their inspectors by 5. They've told us they're not going to inspect abattoirs and small butcher shops with the frequency they did before. If you have a good inspection record, you won't be inspected as often. So, okay, I guess, except for it's meat, and that seems dangerous. We haven't heard anybody. I mean, again, this is an omnibus bill, so we haven't heard much about it. We haven't heard the finance minister really say much about it at all, other than the government talking points about how great everything is. Why are we cutting back meat inspectors, Mr. Speaker? Why are we reducing our oversight of abattoirs? The only thing I hear about abattoirs when I travel in this province is that we need more of them. People want more ability to get their product to market and to get it processed safely and cleanly and legally. But reduced inspection? We've had those scandals. I'm old enough to remember people getting sick. So I certainly hope that someone will actually get up and speak to this. I think it's strange that we're lowering the standard of inspection. Clause 83 seems to lower the standard of inspection at licensed meat plants. It allows a licensed meat plant owner to authorize a meat plant representative to carry out certain powers and duties as established by this act, including inspection powers. So employees of meat plants, stay with me, can inspect the meat in that plant. The people paid by the plant say whether or not the meat is inspected. That's a conflict of interest. That doesn't make me feel like I'm safe. Buy local. Taste of Nova Scotia. Oh wait, sorry, that got cut. What is it called now? Can't remember. We need to expand our local food production. We need more local food that we have more trust in. Firing meat inspectors does not seem to accomplish that goal, Mr. Speaker. Crown Lands Act. This seems to be directed at protesters, Mr. Speaker, and this government has made pretty clear how they feel about protesters. We were told today that, yesterday in a clarification around the caregivers benefit, and today in the Premier's comments about the changes, the unchanges to the budget. We were told it wasn't because of the loud protesters. No, it was because of the quiet conversations. And I think that's true, I'm sure. The quiet conversations had a lot to do with it. But I bet the loud protesters didn't hurt either. And there are many protesters who have been for some time protesting certain forestry operations. Many of them are Indigenous. In the last session, we saw legislation that was perceived to be targeted at these groups. And here again, we see a power given to conservation officers to impound vehicles. If the obstruction is a vehicle, a conservation officer could withhold its return to the owner unless relevant.
Order. I recognize the honourable member for, sorry guys, Inverness.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the member entertain a question, please?
I recognize the honourable. I recognize the honourable leader of the official opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure what this government is playing at right now. There are lots of times to have conversations and to have questions. We would welcome engagement on any of this in a meaningful and constructive way. But at the moment, my job is to suggest to the House why this needs to go back, not to answer questions from the government. But at any rate, why are we giving the powers of policing to conservation officers? That's the question that this provision poses, Mr. Speaker. And it doesn't answer it. It doesn't. We have contracts with the RCMP. We have municipal police forces. I mean, all of that's a whole nother conversation that I'm sure we'll have with the Minister of Justice over the coming weeks and months and maybe even years, depending on how long we're all lucky enough to occupy these seats. It's certainly a conversation I've been having with many ministers of justice for many, many years. But the conversation I've never had is about why we need to give conservation officers policing powers. Why, Mr. Speaker? Why should conservation officers be allowed to impound a vehicle? If it's so important, call the RCMP. There's a law being broken. Deal with it. That's the system. We don't have crown corporations anymore. We don't have boards. We pick university presidents. We pick NSCC presidents. And now this government does its own policing. Real weird, Mr. Speaker. We don't direct the police, Mr. Speaker. That is a fundamental principle of policing. It is incredibly important, and I will say that this government has skirted the line on that principle in the last few months. They have made statements in the media, in particular in relation to cannabis, about things that they have represented law enforcement to have said that they have come out and said that they didn't, about ways that law enforcement should or should not do things. That is inappropriate, Mr. Speaker. And it seems that the reaction to that has been for this government to create their own police force that they can, in fact, direct.
It's kind of scary.
That is incredibly problematic, particularly without anybody willing to stand up and say why. A hot topic of conversation this session has been ministerial responsibility, Mr. Speaker, or the absence thereof. It is very rare to hear a cabinet minister in this government give a fulsome explanation of a bill or a budget or a provision or a decision or a timeline. But I certainly hope we hear something about this, Mr. Speaker, because nestled in to the middle of an omnibus bill called the Financial Measures Act, which we're going to keep debating in the middle of the night so that media can't properly cover it and nobody really knows what's going on, this government is making their own police force. Great idea. So, you know, I've tried to canvass what I think are some of the reasons that we should give this budget back. And I want to say, like, this is an invitation. This is an invitation. This is a bad budget. It's a bad bill. It's riddled with problems. Or, put another way, it's riddled with solutions to problems that no one identified. Nobody's happy with it, Mr. Speaker. I will say one silver lining is the number of people who have in fact spoken against it. People with whom many of us have been speaking for years and have plainly said to us that they feared speaking up because they worried their funding would be risked. Arts organizations, disability organizations, nonprofits, environmental organizations. They're not worried anymore because they see how capricious this government is. They know it could happen at any time, and it doesn't really matter what they do or how important they are or what the expert advice that this government receives is. It all comes down to politics. What do the polls say? I would suggest that they probably say that this government is in trouble because they're not listening to Nova Scotians. This is not what Nova Scotians are asking for. They're asking for affordability, and there are some promises of that. So back to the bridge tolls. If this is the right idea, if this is something we need to save us money, okay, get up and defend it. Talk about it. Tell us how the decision was made. Tell us how much money we're saving. Tell us how we're going to pay for that. Tell us how the brand new bridge that we need in the next decade, probably $1 billion, how's that going to get paid for? What's the deficit going to look like then? What's the debt going to look like then? Talk to us about it. Tell us. The tax cuts that we hear about, if you're not making a lot of money, those tax cuts, they help. Every little bit helps. They're not super meaningful. A consumption tax, you might save $50 or $100 a year. It's not nothing. Maybe a few $100 makes a difference if you need it. Is that the best way to help people save money? We cut the affordability tax credit. I don't know. Nobody's really explaining that. Traffic, Mr. Speaker. The bridge tolls, that again was, you know, there was some blanket idea that that was going to address traffic, but that would have been addressed. Those toll booths were going away anyway. You know what's going to make traffic a lot worse? Taking away the student bus passes in HRM. It's an HRM issue. We don't have tons of HRM MLAs on the government side. We have a bunch, but but not the majority. I understand that. That might not be a priority, but it's $600,000, Mr. Speaker. It's a pretty small amount of money. And it gives kids freedom, and it gives them the ability to get around, and it keeps their parents' cars off the road. We need people to be able to take transit, and not just in HRM, but across the province. And I'm told, although we still have not been provided with the list of the uncuts, I'm told rural transit, a lot of that is going to be put back. That's great. I hope so. It's really important that people can get around. It's necessary. But why aren't we thinking more about that? And why aren't we thinking about infrastructure in a broader way, Mr. Speaker? I was talking to a singer earlier today who was at the protest, very successful. And he said to me, I was looking through that bill and I saw that there's a few $1 million in there for, I think it was, I don't know, Class J roads maybe, like, you know, fixing up the roads, the gravel roads. And he said, doesn't this government understand that the small amount of money in grants to artists is like those roads that help forestry trucks get their product to market? That's what helps, that's the infrastructure that helps artists get their product to market. Braden Lamb, great young singer-songwriter, just got signed to Universal, huge deal. Ran into him, he's so excited. He said, never would have happened if I didn't have the support from CCTH. Never, if I couldn't have gotten that grant. And a lot of artists won't get those grants. He's going to bring tax revenue into this province. He's going to have shows. He's going to generate revenue. I mean, Dartmouth is a hotbed. We've got Joel Plaskett. We've got Mo Kenny. We've got a ton of Olympians. We haven't even talked for support for sport or any of those things. Like, all of that is revenue, and those cuts, Mr. Speaker, are incredibly short-sighted. Incredibly short-sighted. The return on investment on many of the things that have been cut is incredibly high. But more than that, like, it's who we are. It's what we're proud of. And so before I end, I do want to take a minute to talk about the things that I think, we'll find out tomorrow, I guess, were reversed. The conversations that I have had in the last 24 hours have been among the most upsetting in my career. Caregivers talking about how they were praying that this government would not cut their benefit and force them to put their young disabled son into an institution. Autistic adults who had finally found a job and a place that they belong, fired, hopefully rehired, but already fired, and having to assimilate that information and understand what that meant for their dignity and their life and their livelihood. This is a government that, you know, in the words of the disability community, and I have that here, this government punches down. The budget punches down. This is how it was characterized, not by us. Not by us. It's a quote. This budget punches down. It has to feel bad to have your budget characterized that way, Mr. Speaker. It has to feel bad, and I'm sure it does feel bad because it seems like very few people actually had say in how this budget was concocted. And so while some of those cuts were reversed today, And I am so pleased for the people who don't have to worry the way that they have worried. Many of them haven't been. This budget is flawed. It doesn't meet the moment. It doesn't meet the need. I suggest that it reduces our ability to raise revenue in the short term, because cutting museums, cutting language programs, cutting arts and cultures, cutting organizational grants, cutting theater grants, that's going to be a cut in tourism revenue. Plain and simple. That's what this budget does. And so I would ask again that this government please take advantage of this reasoned amendment, take the budget back, talk to your departments, listen to what they have to say, make some hard decisions. This budget requires hard decisions, there's no question, but make hard decisions that don't punch down. Have some financial accountability. Stop spending billions of dollars outside of budget. Stop sole source contracting. Listen to the Auditor General, the only independent officer of the legislature that still exists. Take this budget back. Please do a better job. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've listened intently to several members of the opposition talk about this motion. I'm going to speak against the motion. I think the budget should carry through. I think that the work has been done by Cabinet, the work that's been done by the Premier, the work that's been done by bureaucrats across government is in best interest of Nova Scotians. These are tough times. We are facing an intense fiscal challenge. But it's not the first time we face an intense fiscal challenge like this. I think back to 2008. I was elected shortly after 2008 and 2009, about the same time as the last NDP government was elected. Now, we faced a huge economic crisis that was started in the United States, very similar to what we're facing now. This was a mortgage housing crisis, an economic collapse. We saw big mortgage houses actually go to business. Government had to come in and bail them out. They had to bail out big car companies like Chrysler, Ford, and other ones. Times were really tough. And in tough times, governments have to make tough decisions. But the tough decisions made by the previous NDP government were to cut core services. And I remember slashing health care, slashing education. I'd been a principal before I was elected to Parliament. And I know my school system, at that time it was a school board, now it's a regional centre, they argued it was a 33% cut when you counted in cost pressures that they were facing in terms of rising inflation. Imagine cutting 33% out of our regional centres for education. That was a choice that the NDP made. But that wasn't the only choice. They cut core services. But they also raised taxes. One of the first things they did, after saying they wouldn't do it, was to raise the HST by 2%. The federal government had very recently lowered it. So what they did effectively was stole the tax cut from the average everyday citizen that all the other citizens across Canada continue to enjoy, putting us at a competitive disadvantage economically. Our sales tax was higher than anywhere else in the country. Imagine the pressure that put on the average everyday citizen, but also imagine the pressure that put on our small business, which is the economic driver of Nova Scotia's economy. Higher taxes lead to economic shrinkage, and that's what happened in Nova Scotia. And that was because of the choices of the NDP at the time. They love taxes. We heard their sycophants out there campaigning this week. Raise our taxes, raise our taxes. Well, we know who they're cheering for. I haven't had one email or one phone call or one text message from anyone in Colchester, Musqueam Valley asking me to raise their taxes. Maybe they are, but I don't think anyone in the rural Nova Scotia is. I can tell you that for sure. Because tough times affect all of us. And in tough times, you have to make tough decisions. And that's exactly what we're doing. The easy path is to simply raise taxes. Raise taxes, increase the revenue, and you can fund everything you always did. But that's not the prudent way. And especially right now, when the top issue in Nova Scotia amongst everyone I've talked to, and the polling backs it up, is affordability. Who wants to raise taxes when affordability is the biggest crisis people are facing? The single-parent mom with 3 children, trying to make ends meet, trying to pay for their heat, trying to pay for groceries. Can you imagine what raising taxes will do to that family? Or I guess the NDP could choose to cut the lunch program. I mean, other parties have talked about doing it. We did it. Almost 10 million lunches served already for elementary students, junior high students, and it's soon going to be throughout the high schools as well. What an incredible investment in young families across this province. I know from my experience and background, you can't learn on an empty stomach. We've seen it time and time again, and schools across Nova Scotia for years have found ways to feed hungry children. But it's a lot of work. It takes a lot of volunteers. It takes a lot of donations. It takes time away from teachers who were always trying to educate their students, but now they're having to worry about feeding them first. That lunch program and the Breakfast for Learning program has eliminated that challenge so teachers can focus on what they should be focusing on, which is educating the students, not feeding them. So having that program in place, it's expensive, but it's an investment in the future, and I'd hate to see the cuts the NDP would make, because we saw it before. Given the choice, they cut core services. They cut education. They cut healthcare. They raise taxes. We make the tougher choice. We look inside government spending itself and try to find efficiencies where we can find them. And you know what? That's the hardest way. That's the tough way. And we don't always get it right. But one thing I think this Premier has shown, and this government has shown, is when we take a step too far, we'll step back. We'll listen to people. If we get off track on a decision and Nova Scotians think we're going the wrong direction, we will change track. And I'm very proud of what the Premier did today. I think all Nova Scotians should be proud of that. So I look forward to continuing this debate. I support this budget, I support this Premier, and I support this government. We're going to work with Nova Scotians each and every day. But this is a challenge that's facing all provinces across the country. It's not a problem that was started in Nova Scotia. It's not a problem that was started in any other province, but it's one we're all facing together. And when you look at the challenges of budgeting that all the provinces who have brought forward their budgets so far, we're all in this together. BC, and that's an NDP government, a $13 billion deficit for a province with just about 5.8 million people. Think about that. That would be like us bringing in a $2.3 billion deficit. $2.3 billion per capita. That would be the equivalent. Think what that could do to the credit rating Nova Scotia has. Our debt servicing costs would skyrocket if we brought that in because the credit rating agencies would push us way down. It's not a responsible choice. It's not a choice for Nova Scotia. It's not a choice for the future. We can't bring deficits that big. And BC is going to be in trouble for doing it, but they have to make their own choices. On top of that deficit, they're also significantly raising taxes in British Columbia right now. That is a challenge they're facing. New Brunswick, just under 1 million people. Their budget deficit is about $1 billion. Again, a higher per capita deficit than we're bringing here in Nova Scotia. And what's the real challenge, and the Minister of Health will know this well, is right now in Nova Scotia, because the work and the investment's been done by the Department of Health, by that minister and by this government, our attachment rate to a family practitioner or a nurse practitioner is at 93%. New Brunswick hasn't made the same investments, and right now in New Brunswick it's only 73%. So they're facing $1 billion deficit, and they only have an attachment rate of 73%. They're facing trouble.
Order. Order. I ask that the honourable member speak about the amendment. Thank you. I recognize the honourable Attorney General and Minister of Justice.
And I'll quickly just finish up on, and I'll relate this back to the motion. What we're talking about tonight is, should this budget carry through? I think it should, because the challenge that we face is the challenge they're facing other provinces. And all provinces have to make tough decisions, and this budget does contain tough decisions, which is why I think it should go forward. And the last province I'll mention is Alberta. Alberta has a $9 billion deficit. Again, a deficit higher per capita than Nova Scotia. Can you imagine, of all the economic power, all the resource industries they have, the challenge they're facing per capita is a deficit higher than ours. This budget is the right budget for Nova Scotia. We need to debate it in this House. We need to send it to committee. We need to hear in public bills the ideas of Nova Scotians when they bring them to us. So I stand behind getting back on track, getting this budget back on the floor of this House, debating it through second reading, and getting it to public bills. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will be thrilled to stay on the... I was hearing rescind motion, and I actually think, yes, no, I was just going to say, I believe it's called a reasoned motion, but I actually think rescind motion works as well. So, but reasoned motion. I'm thrilled tonight at 10:41 to be standing and speaking on the reasoned motion put forward by the NDP around the Financial Measures Act. And so I always think the best starting point is sort of to focus us on what we're talking about. And in this case, rather than diving into the act, I want to turn our minds back to what the reasoned motion actually is. And it is a motion that the bill be amended by deleting all words after that and substituting that the Bill 198, the Financial Measures Act, order be discharged and the bill be withdrawn. So we're talking about the complete withdrawal of the Financial Measures Act. And so the honourable member for the NDP gave a variety of reasons for putting that forward. And I will say that the sentiments that I'm hearing from constituents around the Financial Measures Act and the budget, as they're quite related, very much echo what the reasons the member gave for proposing this motion. I have received countless emails, and they say things like, all things around the budget need to be redone. I have an individual who is pleading with me and others. I'm often copied on these. These are often emails that go to other MLAs, particularly PC MLAs, and then they also reach out to me, pleading with us to do whatever we possibly can to make this entire experience stop. And there's one, I think, that I think I'd like to read into the record because it's a good representation of the kinds of sentiments that people are expressing that support the reasoned motion. And I need to just catch myself because there are proper names in here, so bear with me. I would like my MLA...
Order, you will have to table them, so just because you're worried about their names, no, you have to table. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
For clarification, may I table it with a name rescinded, or shall I paraphrase instead of? Okay.
Order. I'm waiting to see what you actually do from them. If you quote them, they can't be tabled. If you read them, they have to be tabled. You cannot redact any information. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Perfect. Thank you, Madam Speaker, for that clarification. I will not read from this. I will paraphrase so that it doesn't need to be tabled. I would love to have had opportunity and time to get consent from all the people who've written in, the hundreds, probably thousands of people who've written in, but there's been no opportunity for that. So I would love to be able to read from this, and I actually think he would appreciate that. But if the expectation and ruling is that we can't do that, then I'll go ahead and paraphrase. So this constituent wrote in and asked me to introduce a motion of non-confidence in the Premier's government. And he goes on to state, to say that the reckless spending of tax dollars without parliamentary approval, he attributes that, the reckless spending of tax dollars without parliamentary approval, to the source of the deficit in the budget. And he indicates that it's time to hold the Premier responsible for that. He also goes on to reference the findings of the Auditor General and identifies that she also has been calling the Premier out personally on this issue for a number of years now. And he points out that there was an attempt to remove power from the Auditor General in response to that. This constituent, along with hundreds, possibly thousands of others who've written to me, consider this situation, and by situation I mean the financial situation we're in, the legislation that's being tabled, the budget that's being put forward, to be outrageous. And he was actually upset that I hadn't already submitted a non-confidence or asked for a non-confidence vote already. And he, even recognizing the unlikelihood that such a thing would pass, wanted to see that motion put forward as a demonstration of the work that we're doing to try and bring this to a halt, and to demonstrate to him and to other MLAs and to Nova Scotians that we in this House are not just going through the motions and pocketing the tax dollars that we earn. So what I do want to say is I really try to follow the rules in this House. I very much do. And so I explored this option, and my understanding is that an oral motion for this is not in order. And so I'm not going ahead with an oral motion. And I'm hopeful that this constituent will still feel represented, because I am trying my level best to express in this House the frustration and anger and resentment and fear and concern that constituents have over the Financial Measures Act, other legislation, the budget. And so I thought that was a really good summary of the kinds of things that we are hearing in constituency that really, I think, support the reasoned motion that the NDP have put forward. And I have to say I appreciate this motion. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk on this, because so many constituents are expressing the same desire and the same attitude about the Financial Measures Act and the budget. So that's the starting point. The reasoned motion. But the reasoned motion is a motion that relates to the Financial Measures Act. And Financial Measures Act is a significant piece of legislation in any government sitting, in any budget sitting. And we haven't really talked about what a Financial Measures Act is or does. We did hear from the Minister of Finance, who tabled this act, and he certainly has some components of this act, but he is only one of 7 or 8 at least ministers who have legislation that's, that have amendments under this Omnibus Act. So we did hear from the Minister of Finance. We heard from the Minister of Finance for a whopping 6 minutes and 30 seconds. So all of the items that we've already talked about relating to the Financial Measures Act, that live within the Financial Measures Act, that the government is putting forward, you know, and we're still only really talking, you know, we've only had, I think, maybe a couple of hours on the Financial Measures Act itself. The remainder of this debate has been on the motion, the reasoned motion. But we only had the benefit of 6 minutes and 30 seconds from the Minister of Finance. And so I would say he skimmed the surface of the contents of the Financial Measures Act. And I think that that's being generous. But what he didn't do, and what I haven't yet really heard done, although we've had standing on points of order and some other discussions that kind of move around this topic, we haven't really talked about what exactly a Financial Measures Act is and how it fits within the budget process. And I think that's incredibly important because that, I think, underpins a lot of the conversation that we're having, some of the tension and confusion that is arising over what is properly within debate and what is not properly within debate. And so I thought it would be a helpful starting point to talk about what a Financial Measures Act is and what it typically contains. And then do that in comparison to the other elements of the budget and talk about and understand together how they interact and how they work together. So that's where I'm going next. So a Financial Measures Act is typically, it's used in our province, it's used in other provinces as well, and it's typically introduced annually, and it goes alongside and in conjunction with a provincial budget. And it's a piece of legislation that provides the legal authority to implement the various financial changes that are required to implement the budget. And so what would those financial measures be? Is it the money transfer? It's actually not the money transfer. That's separate. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. It's other types of mechanisms that help support the budget. So it's things like tax changes, fee adjustments, other financial policies. And these are things that relate to the budget. They connect with the budget. They implement the budget, but they are not necessarily part of the budget. They are not line items. They're practices or measures that support the line items and the programs within the budget. It typically serves as a routine but comprehensive bill, and it is often presented, it is often legitimately an omnibus bill because a variety of acts may be implicated and may be impacted in any budget. And it aligns with government's fiscal priorities. So it may be associated with reducing a deficit, managing debt, or updating tax legislation. So let's dig a little deeper into what those things might be. Tax changes. So the kinds of measures that you would see in a Financial Measures Act relating to tax changes might be amending income tax acts to change corporate or personal tax rates, making adjustments to tax credits themselves, or harmonizing provincial tax with federal programs. So that's a typical clause or typical number of sections that you would see in any Financial Measures Act. That would be a usual provision to see. The Financial Measures Act can also adjust fees and levies. So if there are fees associated with vaping, in our case, electric vehicles, licensing costs, penalty structures associated with changes that are happening in the budget or in other legislation coming forward during the course of a budget session. Those are other types of provisions that one normally and usually would see in a Financial Measures Act. There may also be elements in a Financial Measures Act that address budgetary authority. This, though, in Nova Scotia starts to overlap a bit with our Appropriations Act, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But at times, a Financial Measures Act may clarify budgetary authorities, like, for example, borrowing authorities for the province, or authorizing particular expenditures relating to government priorities. But again, I do want to put the caveat on that the Financial Measures Act is not the authorizer of the actual budget here in Nova Scotia. We have a different act that does that, and I will explain that in a minute. Sometimes a Financial Measures Act can also perform housekeeping functions and modernize legislation. It can be, again, it is typically an omnibus bill. It's a bill that is often presented as an omnibus. And so it may repeal outdated laws, transfer oversight of departments, and streamline administrative processes. And I think under typical circumstances, that those provisions can be appropriately placed in a Financial Measures Act. Financial Measures Acts as well may implement changes that that authorize support for particular sectors. So at times in our budgets, we see targeted financial relief to particular sectors, like HST rebates, or expansion of tax credits for manufacturing or industry or other sectors. And so those are examples of other financial mechanisms that need to be put in place to support the provisions of the budget, and that one might see in a Financial Measures Act. The next category is tax relief or tax increases. And this is, I think, a regular one that one sees. If there are changes that are being made to the tax structure in the course of a budget, you would see those changes not show up in the budget necessarily, or not show up, well, you see them as line items in the budget, but you won't see them show up in the Appropriations Act. You'll actually see the specific terms of them set out in the Financial Measures Act. And so that might include things like raising the basic personal amount for income tax, which we've done previously, reducing business tax rates or increasing business tax rates, or making changes to taxes on things like tobacco and vaping products. The Financial Measures Act often regularly also includes administrative changes, sometimes like food safety or licensing between departments. Again, it can be housekeeping, but it authorizes and implements other changes that may live in other bills or in the budget itself. And finally, the final category that I wanted to mention that is very regularly found in a Financial Measures Act would be changes relating to corporations or investments. And so we have legislation that allows for corporate structure. And so you may see in a Financial Measures Act corporate restructuring authorization or legislation that allows for corporate restructuring, for example, like the dissolution of a commission or changes to Crown corporation mandates. So fundamentally, a Financial Measures Act is the legislative tool that turns the financial promises of a budget, of that budget speech, and the resolutions that are put forward as part of the budget into law. And so that's what we look for when we see what a Financial Measures Act is. And so having laid that groundwork, which I think is really important, I mean, we're debating the Financial Measures Act, we're debating the motion.
Order. What we're debating is the reasoned amendment. So what you have to talk about is the reasoned amendment. I ask that you talk about the reasoned amendment. I've been giving everyone a wide berth on this. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
So the reasoned amendment, I appreciate that, Madam Speaker. The reasoned amendment is an amendment. I'll just go back to that so we can capture that. The reasoned amendment is an amendment that amends our Financial Measures Act and changes deletes all words after the words that and substitutes that Bill 198, the Financial Measures Act, order be discharged and the bill be withdrawn. So I personally needed to really understand what a Financial Measures Act was and what it should include to truly understand, A, what our Financial Measures Act actually includes and how those two things relate to one another, but also the appropriateness of the order, the reasoned motion to discharge the bill. So I found that personally, in my work to prepare myself for debate, I found that very necessary. In fact, I couldn't come and do this debate without really understanding that. So that was the first thing, was understanding what a Financial Measures Act is. And I think it's also important that we understand how a Financial Measures Act, how it relates to the budget. Because again, we're talking about the expenditure of government funds, and the Financial Measures Act authorizes that. But it's not the only thing that authorizes that, and it works in conjunction with our budget. And so the question of how it fits in the budget and within the budget process is a really important one. So we've talked about the Financial Measures Act, and we've talked about, what I haven't talked about is how it flows through the House. The Financial Measures Act flows through the House like all of the other most of the other legislation, all the other legislation that gets tabled. So it takes first reading, and then subsequently it comes to second reading, during which we debate. And so that first reading happened on March 25th, second reading began on March 9th. And we're continuing with that, and we're talking now about a motion on second reading. And so it will flow through in the usual course, through second reading, through the Committee on Public Bills, back to third reading, and those are the steps of debate for the Financial Measures Act, and then it will be passed, presumably, or maybe not, depending on the result of this reasoned motion. The budget itself, though, flows through a different process, and I think it's really important because, again, the Financial Measures Act implements the budget. The budget itself is tabled as a speech initially, and then the process for passing the budget, and this is, I think, really important, and I needed to understand this to understand the Financial Measures Act that was tabled and the reasoned motion, and whether it was appropriate, whether it was reflective of what my constituents were asking.
Order. I recognize the honourable member for Hants East.
Speaker, on a point.
Wait.
Oh, apologize. Madam Speaker, point of order. Nothing that the member is talking about has anything to do about the motion. I understand she's a lawyer. She understands stuff. I'd be more worried about hearing about the motion. Thank you.
It's not a point of order, but it does lead me to say, once again, please stay on topic. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I could use some clarification because I am trying to stay on topic. I'm trying to stay on the reasoned motion, which is a motion to discharge the Financial Measures Act. And so I'm trying to lay the groundwork for understanding that motion and how it fits within the Financial Measures Act, which actually works with our budget process. So I just, to me, I feel like I've complied with that, so I just want to be sure I know what's being expected.
So the comments has to relate to why the bill and why it should be discharged. That's what it should be about, not how it's made or the process it goes through. It needs to go on, and I've said this before in the speech from the honourable member, meat inspections. There's 25 different topics you can talk about in this bill, added on to what was said in the speech. So I asked you to talk about the rescind of motion, which is meat inspection, community, conservations, tax credits, EVs, etc. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Okay, so I appreciate that. So just so I'm clear, and I'm not, this is not a challenge, I just want to be sure I really understand. It's not appropriate to talk about what a Financial Measures Act normally includes as we work through whether the reasoned motion to discharge the Financial Measures Act is appropriate?
So, like I said earlier, for example, with the other members, I'm allowing a broad, so a little context is fine, but we're now 24 minutes in almost. And so, and it's, you just weave it in and out, okay? So a little context is fine, but a little context. Well, technically we're 23 and a half minutes in. So the rescind motion or amendment is what you are to be talking about. And a little context is fine, but not forever. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. All right, well, we've talked about what the Financial Measures Act is. I think that I'm hearing that it's not appropriate to talk about, and this is again a point of, I just want to make sure that I'm within the rules that the speaker that the speaker is making. So I just want to be clear, talking about the Financial Measures Act a little bit, or what's supposed to be in it is okay, but before I go on to the next thing, I want to know whether it's suitable or not.
Here's this, order. So I'm not making the rules, I'm following the rules, and I'm asking members to follow the rules, first and foremost. So I will call order if you, and again, weaving in and out is fine, but not sticking on to what we're supposed to be talking about is not fine. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about, and it was important for me to understand this and understand how they work together, and I will start down this path, and I do, if this is not an appropriate path, I'll be happy to move on. But the next thing that was important for me to understand, because the Financial Measures Act works in conjunction with the budget and the Appropriations Act. And I needed to understand how they work together to really understand whether the reasoned motion to discharge the Financial Measures Act was appropriate, whether it was suitable, and what that would mean in relation to the budget and the Appropriations Act itself. And so for me, that was an important piece of knowledge to really inform myself about this debate. And so in terms of understanding that, because what we've heard tonight is that the Financial Measures Act is not where we debate the budget itself. And so, in fact, the budget debate, I do believe, was referenced at some point as being part of the Appropriations Act. So I really needed to puzzle through that process, because we've talked about how the Financial Measures Act flows through the House. It flows through in the normal course in the way other bills do. The budget, though, it is authorized by legislation, but it actually follows a completely different process. It relies on the Financial Measures Act to implement it, but it follows a different process as it goes through the House. So the budget is tabled as a speech. And then the House goes into committee of the whole relating to the budget, and which is important. It's an important distinction, because that is not the floor of this legislature. That is a committee. It is not the same as debating a bill. It involves making speeches. So in one chamber, speeches are underway, and speeches take place around the budget, but they're not technically debate on the budget, and those take place over time. But then what also happens concurrently is that estimates take place. Again, estimates are in a subcommittee. They are not taking place on the floor of this legislature. And those two things proceed in tandem. And they are informative of the budget, which is then supported by the Financial Measures Act. So they help us understand the Financial Measures Act, and they enlighten us on what the Financial Measures Act will do in relation to the budget, but they are not debate on the floor of the legislature. So the budget is proceeding. It's proceeding through estimates. It's proceeding through speeches on supply. But so far in that process, there's no act or bill that is relating to the budget. And then so once those estimates are complete and the speeches on supply are complete, then what happens to authorize the budget?
I recognize the honourable member for Argyle.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I recognize it's a little bit past 11. Again, questioning if the member is sticking to the motion. Again, going through, talking about process of the FMA and the process of bill legislation. Everybody in this chamber knows how a bill's passed, but this is not speaking to the motion that the opposition's brought forward.
I am going to dismiss that point of order. I ask that the member for Lunenburg West do stay on the bill, not the process, but the bill. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Madam Speaker. And I am very much trying to stay on the Financial Measures Act, and very specifically on the reasoned motion around the Financial Measures Act. So I'll just complete that thought, and then my next, I suspect the House will be very relieved that my next step will actually be to go to the bill itself and talk very specifically about the bill. But to me, this was really important, and it was important as well. Constituents have asked me over and over again about this process and how the Financial Measures Act relates to the budget, and what each of them do and how they work together. And so this really is a fundamental and important element that needs to be understood to truly understand whether it is appropriate to discharge the Financial Measures Act, because we really can't understand what the consequences of that motion would be if we don't understand how that works together with the budget. So I think I got to the point where we were talking about the conclusion of the speeches into supply and the debates, sorry, not the debates, the questioning that happens in estimates. And as I had mentioned, and it is really important for this House to know, and certainly constituents have been very interested to understand this as well, none of that takes place on the floor of the legislature. And that means it's not part of our record. So although it's recorded by video, it doesn't form part of the Hansards. And so it does not form part of the formal records of this legislature. So although sometimes, and I have described this, so it's because I'm trying to simplify things for constituents, I've described our speeches into supply as debate on budget, and that's often what the topic is. But technically speaking, they are not debate on budget because they are not occurring on the floor of this legislature. They are occurring in a committee. And so that's really important. So we've established the parameters around the Financial Measures Act. We've repeatedly discussed tonight that it's not intended necessarily to be wide open to talk about the budget in talking about the Financial Measures Act, although there is some latitude. And so we've also now established and clarified for folks on the floor that the debate on the budget is not happening in estimates, and it's not happening in the subcommittee on supply, which is the speeches into supply. So that brings us to the act that implements the resolutions of the budget, and that's the Appropriations Act. And that works together with the Financial Measures Act to implement the budget. And so then one would expect, possibly, if we haven't had an opportunity to fulsomely debate the budget in the course of our debate on the Financial Measures Act, and there is no technical debate in the course of estimates and supply, that one would expect an opportunity to bring forward constituents' concerns about the budget in debate during the Appropriations Act But in fact, in Nova Scotia, the Appropriations Act is tabled, second reading, and passed without debate all in one day after that process happens. And so that does leave us, and I think that actually is a very good explanation for why historically the Financial Measures Act has been allowed latitude for debate around the budget, because Nova Scotia's process doesn't actually allow MLAs to give voice to the budget in debate on the floor of this House. And that, when I puzzled through that and realized that, was a little concerning to me. So I do appreciate the opportunity that we all have within the latitude that the Speaker gives us on the Financial Measures Act to talk about those concerns, because quite candidly, most of what I'm hearing about from constituents is concern about the budget, and I think they would be very upset to learn that MLAs do not have an opportunity to debate those things. So that brings me around now and back to the terms of the Financial Measures Act that are in front of us. And let me just gather my papers so that I have those right at hand. I had a lot of other things to talk about, but I know that as this proceeds through the House, we'll get to those. So bear with me a moment, please. Here we are. I skipped 3 whole sections. Okay. Nope, excuse me. I have 2 of my papers. Here we are. All right. Now to the meat of it. So we've talked about what a Financial Measures Act normally includes, should include. We've talked about how the Financial Measures Act works together with our budget process and the Appropriations Act to support the implementation of the budget and the fiscal measures that the government is proposing. And so now, having established all that groundwork, it's time to look at the actual Financial Measures Act and see how it measures up to our expectations. So I think the starting point that I will, rather than diving into the clauses, I do think I'll just do an overview that covers the departments and the ministers who have bills that are included within the omnibus bill that is the Financial Measures Act. Because I think that's helpful. As I had mentioned earlier on, I did appreciate the Minister of Finance's introduction here at second reading to the Financial Measures Act. I think the brevity was a little unfortunate at 6 minutes and roughly 30 seconds. I think in an act of this girth, one would expect more fulsome remarks. Just looking to see how long this bill actually is. I've got a version that is 47 pages, and it doesn't have a whole lot of commentary in it. It's largely, this 47-page version is almost all clauses or appendices. So it's a significant bill. It has a significant number of clauses in it. So one really would have expected, I mean, I don't know how you can cover 47 pages worth of clauses in 6 minutes and 30 seconds. I mean, that seems, you gotta talk real fast to cover that ground. But you know what? There are multiple ministers who have bills within this, so you know, their comments also would round this out and help us probably understand the implications of this 47-page piece of legislation. Because, so well, let's see, we've got the Minister of Municipal Affairs, who has at least a couple of bills in this act. Or, my apologies, a couple of acts who would be amended by this bill. So, but we didn't hear from the Minister of Municipal Affairs that I can recall. So that didn't flesh out the Minister of Finance's 6.5 minutes. We also have the Minister of Natural Resources. A number of bills in here relate to the Minister of Natural Resources, and I'm just going to count those. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, six, I think, thereabouts, 6 bills, 6 acts are amended, 6 acts that belong to or live within the portfolio of the Minister of Natural Resources are included as well in the Financial Measures Act. And I'm just going to check my notes here. I don't have any notes on the Minister of Natural Resources remarks. I believe I've been here the whole time. I don't. It's possible when I stepped out to use the washroom, I might have missed those remarks, that maybe somebody will correct me, but my belief is that we didn't hear from the Minister of Natural Resources on this bill, even though she has a half a dozen pieces of legislation that are amended by this omnibus bill. The third minister that has responsibility under this bill is the Minister of Service Nova Scotia, and I'm just going to look through. I think it's just one piece of legislation from the Minister of Service Nova Scotia, but I don't believe as well that we heard from the minister.
I recognize the honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
A point of order, Madam Speaker. As we know, there's been 2 speakers on the bill. The minister who introduced it and a member of the opposition who, after a few remarks, put a motion on the floor to a hoist motion. So commenting on all these people who haven't spoken on the bill, well, quite frankly, they haven't had a chance, Madam Speaker.
It's not a point of order. It's not a hoist motion either. It is rescind a motion, right? I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm loath to speak on behalf or presume to speak on behalf of members of the opposition, but I'm going to go out on a limb on this one and suggest if we had noticed that every minister who has acts who are amended under this bill wanted to provide remarks on the introduction of this bill, we would have happily remained in our seats and allowed each of those ministers to speak before we got up to debate. And so I certainly can speak for myself in saying that. And certainly if we were given an indication that that was going to happen, we would be welcoming of that. I think it's really incumbent on the government who is putting forward a bill to do the first step in introducing it and explaining it. And so I do think that that's an important point to make in response to that not point of order that was just raised. So I'll continue. The next minister that has legislation that is impacted by the Financial Measures Act that the government has introduced is the Minister of Public Works. And that's to be expected. We know that there's, public works is a significant capital expenditure in any province. Certainly in Nova Scotia, it's a significant capital expenditure. And so it would not be surprising to see a Minister of Public Works have bills that are included within, legislation that's included within a Financial Measures Act bill. And so just want to count up how many pieces of legislation the Minister of Public Works, just one. But we didn't have the benefit of the Minister of Public Works' remarks to understand the context either. So we've already talked about, and again, I greatly appreciate the Minister of Finance's 6 minutes and 30 seconds of remarks. There's a couple of other ministers here, I think. Yes, there are. The next minister who has legislation that is impacted by the Act respecting certain financial and other government measures is the Minister of Agriculture. And actually, I believe that's one that keeps getting referenced as a good topic of conversation for the Financial Measures Act, and that's the Meat Inspection Act. So I will absolutely come to that for sure. But there's some more in here as well, so I just wanted to count those up. 1, 2, just 2. Minister of Agriculture has 2, but unfortunately we didn't hear from him at the introduction of this bill either, so that we didn't get the benefit of that. And then I believe we are down to the last minister who has legislation, and that would be the Attorney General and Minister of Justice. who only has one act. And although we've heard from him a couple of times now tonight, none of those related to the introduction of the bill that is impacted in this legislation. So we don't have the benefit of that either. So that's my starting point for the bill and the contents of the bill. But it gives a good overview. Again, I think I said at the outset, a financial measure, you know, we often hear of omnibus bills when we're discussing bills on the floor of this House. We often hear critiques of omnibus bills and criticisms of omnibus bills, and I think that that's valid. There are definitely times where omnibus bills are used inappropriately, but there are some examples of types of bills that are properly and regularly used as omnibus bills, and the Financial Measures Act is one example of that. So I think, you know, the fact that we have a number of pieces of legislation that are referenced in and updated by the Act respecting certain financial and other government measures is fairly natural and not at all unreasonable. So on its face, I don't have any criticism with the fact that we have a number of bills bundled into this Act, because that is to be expected in a piece of legislation like the Financial Measures Act. So let's go through now and focus a little more specifically on this particular the particular clauses that actually exist within this bill. So, but I do want to root us, though, because we're not debating the bill at this moment. We are actually debating the reasoned motion, which is, again, an amendment that orders that the Financial Measures Act be discharged and the bill be withdrawn. So, so let's see what's in here that would cause us to vote yes and say, you know what, it is a good idea to amend the Act to have it discharged and withdrawn. So what would cause us to do that? So let's go through and take a look. I'm just going to go through probably just in order, because I think that that's the easiest way to do it. So the first part of this Act is in relation to the Assessment Act. And it's actually a significant number of clauses associated with this. And the explanation of this is that, so it's clauses 2 to 51, and it's to amend the Assessment Act to permit various notices to be served by electronic means where the person to be served has consented to receive such communications, to update the Act to use gender neutral language, and to update cross-references and correct grammatical and typographical stereotypes. Typographical errors, stereotypes. I combined two words. So hang on, I'm just going to go back to the reference that I had. So this allows for electronic service. It is an update to gender neutral language, and it's to use gender neutral language, and it's correcting typos and typographical errors. So I would characterize that as a modernization and housekeeping. And so we talked at the outset, and this is why I come back to say it was really important for me to establish what a Financial Measures Act should include. We talked about Financial Measures Acts regularly incorporating housekeeping and modernization provisions. So on its face, without debating the content of these particular clauses, the concept of this and the objectives of this do fit within what one would normally see in a Financial Measures Act. And so I think, you know, I actually think on that basis, I actually don't see that the reasoned amendment motion would necessarily apply. If I was just looking at that particular clause, I don't know that I would support the reasoned amendment. So that's interesting. But I'll continue on because there's lots more here. We're not just going to make a decision based on one clause. I think we need to look at the bill in a fulsome way. So we'll move on to Part 2. Part 2 relates to the Community Easements Act. And so what does Part 2 say about the Community Easements Act? The Part 2 is actually associated with Clause 52. And it says that The Community Easements Act will be amended to permit the termination by the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia of a community easement where its continuation would produce severe hardship for the landowner and simplify the process when an easement holder ceases to exist. And this is one of those acts that actually fits within natural resources, so it would have been helpful to hear from the Minister of Natural Resources on this one. But in the absence of the Minister of Natural Resources comments, I certainly heard a lot from community on this particular clause. And community was not super supportive. Community was actually really, really concerned. But before I get into those concerns, I'm just going to go back to my beginning remarks where I provided an overview of what a Financial Measures Act normally includes. And so let's see, what is this Community Easements Act amendment? So this relates to land use. This relates to restrictions on land use and dispute resolution mechanisms associated with that. It's not clear to me that that particular type of clause is captured by the variety of things that normally shows up in a Financial Measures Act. It's not a tax change. It doesn't adjust fees and levies. There's no budgetary authority described there. It's not really a modernization. I mean, no, I can't see in any way that that would be described as a modernization. It doesn't support specific sectors with particular financial relief, so that doesn't capture it. It doesn't implement tax increases or decreases. It's certainly more than a mere administrative change, and it's not a change to corporate or investment provisions. So it really doesn't seem like the kind of thing one would expect to see in a Financial Measures Act. And in fact, based on the correspondence and communication that I have had from constituents, not only does it not belong here, it's not welcome at all. It is fundamentally changing what easements are and do. The point of an easement is to provide long-term restrictions on the use of a property to protect an activity or to protect the property itself. It is something that defines the rights between a property holder and property users. And these particular changes undermine the entire point of having easements. They drill a hole right through it. And so not only is this clause not something one would expect to see in a Financial Measures Act, it's also a clause that I really hoped not to ever see at all. And certainly the constituents who have reached out to me with concerns also didn't want to see it. Some of the concerns included, well, first of all, what are community easements? Community easements are easements. They are restrictions on land use that protect the land for certain activities. And so we can see sometimes that easements are in place to protect farmland. Sometimes community easements are in place to protect other types of activities. And if we have a process that makes it easy to get rid of an easement, then what was the point of having the easement at all? There's no protection. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time debating this clause at this moment because we're not debating the bill, we're not debating the clauses. We're looking at the reasoned motion, the reasoned amendment, and to determine whether or not this Financial Measures Act should be discharged and the bill be withdrawn. So on the first clause that I looked at, I would have said, you know, that one's okay. I don't necessarily support the reasoned motion. But the second clause that I've looked at, now I'm supporting the reasoned motion because this one, not only does it not substantively belong in the Financial Measures Act. It has no place here. It doesn't fit with the other kinds of provisions. But it actually is really an awful change, and I've heard from many community members who don't support it. So, you know, and like, that to me is a good reason to support the reasoned motion. So that's number two. Moving along to the next clause. Next clause is in part Part 3, and this is the Conservation Easements Act. And I am not going to repeat my comments on the last one. I will just simply say my issue with its inclusion is the same. So the things I said about the Community Easements Act and the inappropriateness of the inclusion of that in the Financial Measures Act, both from a substantive point of view, from a what is this doing here, it doesn't belong, one of these things is not like the other, and from a this sucks, we don't want it perspective, it shouldn't be here. And so both of these clauses, Community Easements Act clauses and the Conservation Easement Act clauses, their presence in this bill leads me to support the reasoned amendment and the motion to rescind this bill. We're only at Part 3, so we'll continue. But I have only 6 minutes left, so we won't be continuing for long. Part 4. Part 4 is in relation to the Crown Lands Act, and that again is the Minister of Natural Resources. And this is Clause 56. Clause 56 amends the Crown Lands Act to provide that the Minister of Natural Resources may grant or renew timber and resource licenses for a period of up to 5 years without Governor and Council approval, or 10 years with Governor and Council approval. What this doesn't tell us, and again, we've talked about this before, when you're dealing with any amendments to legislation, if it doesn't actually tell you what the originating legislation says, you have to cross-reference it to understand what the changes mean. In this case, currently, the Minister of Natural Resources may grant or renew timber or resources licenses for a period of 2 years. So this reflects a significant increase in the length of time that those timber licenses could be granted. And I think that that could be a good thing. I think it's good to have certainty around land use, and it's good for business to have certainty around the rights that they're being granted to be able to plan longer term around the work that they're doing, both from an asset management perspective and a human resources perspective and an operational flow perspective. So that could be a benefit. But what I would also say is that what this does is restrict government's ability to make decisions around or changes to
Order. There is to be absolutely no eating in the House. I ask everyone to respect that. I recognize the honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So this restricts government's ability, potentially for up to 10 years, to make decisions around land. And so while I see there being potential pros to this clause, there are some drawbacks as well. And again, this is not the time to be debating this clause by clause. I only raise it for the purpose of understanding really where I should stand in representing my constituents on the reasoned motion to discharge the bill. And I think what this clause leads me to say is this has nothing to do with what one would normally expect to see in a Financial Measures Act. This is not about monetary changes. This is not implementing the budget in any way. This is a change, a substantive change to how Crown lands are used and the commitments that are made around Crown lands. And to me, I think that this should not be in the Financial Measures Act. This should be brought forward by the Minister of Natural Resources, potentially under an omnibus bill relating to land use. I'm not against omnibus bills when they are coherent and make logical sense, but this should not be in the Financial Measures Act. So let's continue on. I have 3 minutes left. So if I don't get too much further, I just want to take a tally. We've covered, I think, 4, I'll say clauses, but they're really a number of clauses all bundled in there together, but I'll call them clauses for convenience sake. One of them I thought was on its face reasonable, and I wouldn't support the reasoned motion on the basis of its inclusion. That was the Assessment Act. But the remainder so far appear to me to be completely inappropriately included in this act. And although in some cases, in one of the cases, there may be merits to the clause worth debating and considering, there's no basis for them to be included in the Financial Measures Act. So far, I'm very much in support of the motion that the NDP have put forward to withdraw this bill. But I will continue on until I've run out of time in 2 minutes and 2 seconds to see if the balance changes at all as I cover some of the other clauses. So the next clause is the Forests Act. So we've got some changes to the minister here, and we've got a definition of forest property. And then we come to Clause 60. And I guarantee you I don't have enough time in 1 minute and 40 seconds to talk about how many complaints I have heard from people about Clause 60. And Clause 60 requires an owner of a forest property being used in commercial carbon sequestration transaction to file a report with the minister. Okay, it's good to know about those properties. Authorizes the minister to share the report or information with other parties. Again, information sharing, I like that. Authorizes the minister to direct an owner to disclose whether the property is being used in a carbon sequestration transaction, and if so, to direct the property to file the required report. But this actually goes on. When you read it, that sounds a little just information disclosey, not a whole lot contained within there. But in fact, what's in here is a significant financial penalty to any forest owner, any property owner who has forest, who is not actively, I'm going to say actively logging, but that's not even true, because what I have learned from community is that this will penalize even people who are managing their forests in a sustainable way. They are logging. They are pulling wood off their property for sale and for use. But because they are also using it for sequestration, they will be penalized from a tax perspective. So I guess it relates to taxation, so it's appropriately included in this bill. So from a, does this belong? Is one of these things like the other? Sure, it goes here from a substantive perspective. But should it exist at all? No, it sounds awful. Honestly, it sounds awful. It sounds like...
Order. So I believe it may have been suggested that the proceedings of Committee of the Whole on Supply and Subcommittee on Supply are not transcribed. In fact, they are transcribed after the fact by Hansard, meaning that a permanent record beyond the videotape or video record, recording is created. Those transcripts are posted on the Hansard website after they are completed. Okay, I recognize the honourable member for Kings West.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I would like to thank all members tonight who've been contributing to this debate. It never ceases to amaze me how different all these sides of the House see different things, Madam Speaker, and I think we've heard some different viewpoints on this tonight, spoken by both sides. And I would like to just add my voice to the voice of a lot of people. We represent a lot of people in our constituencies, Madam Speaker, and they represent different backgrounds, they different occupations, and different viewpoints, Madam Speaker. So I'm very proud to stand up and just to continue to advocate for this government and for the continuing the initiatives that we're moving forward. And so with that, Madam Speaker, I'd like to adjourn debate on this motion tonight. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
There has been a request to adjourn debate. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. I recognize the Honourable Deputy Government House Leader.
Speaker, this concludes government business for today. I move that the House do now rise to meet again on Wednesday, March 11th between the hours of 1 p.m. and 11:59 p.m. Following daily routine and question period will be opposition business, and after opposition business will be government business, will include second reading of Bill 198, the Financial Measures Act.
I recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition, or Honourable House Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For opposition business tomorrow, we are calling Bill 107, Affordable and Accessible Childcare Act, Bill 215, the Women's Health Strategy Act, and Bill 84, the Free Birth Control Act.
Thank you, honorable member. The motion is that the host rise to meet again on Wednesday, March 11th, between the hours of 1 p.m. and 11:59 p.m. Would all those in favor of the motion please say aye? Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. We stand adjourned.